Welcome to the Governance Podcast, hosted by the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. My name is Mark Pennington and I'm the Director of the Centre. I'm very pleased to have with me today Professor Prakash Kashwan, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Connecticut. His work focuses on the political economy of institutions, environmental governance and environmental justice. Among other works, he's the author of Democracy in the Woods, published with Oxford University Press in 2017. Prakash spoke to the Centre in an excellent seminar back in February, which was entitled Beyond the Romance of Ideologies, which looked at the relevance of the Ostrom's work to various environmental challenges. That was a very fruitful event, a really engaging seminar, which we did try to record on Zoom, but unfortunately the recording failed. So we thought we would have Prakash back to do a podcast to go over some of the themes that he discussed in that seminar back in February. So Prakash, it's very good to have you with us here today, and thanks very much for taking the time out, and hopefully this recording is going to work.
Right. Thank you, Mark, for having me again. And it was such a wonderful interaction around the event. And I'm so glad that we are able to get into this fresh round of conversations.
Great. So let's start off. And really, I'd like to start by going back to the presentation that you gave to us back in February. So in that presentation, which was called Beyond the Romance of Ideologies, you gave a very comprehensive account of the Bloomington School approach to understanding the role that institutions play in helping to address or in hindering responses to various governance challenges. I wonder if you could start off today by just summarizing what you think is distinctive about the Bloomington School approach to political economy and what sets it apart from other schools that have looked at similar or related questions.
Right. So let's start from what the Bloomington School is popularly known for. As the good folks at the Nobel Prize Committee put it, Lynn was awarded the prize for demonstrating how common property can be successfully managed by user associations. The second aspect of Lynn's work that is often mentioned is the design principle for the sustainable governance of the commons. And the third aspect that is often mentioned is the institutional analysis and development framework, or it's popularly known as IAD framework. However, the IAD framework, the design principles, and the findings about the feasibility of community-based governance of the commons, these are various products of an underlying theoretical foundations of the Bloomington School. And my argument in that talk was mainly that these theoretical foundations are often not adequately discussed, specifically in the context of the commons, because the commons work is often known for the design principles, the IAD framework, and so forth. So the underlying theoretical foundations of the institutional analysis that makes the behavioral theory of user behavior in the commons, that has not been talked about and has not been analyzed very much beyond the community of workshop scholars, because that community actually takes that for granted, and it's not often carefully and clearly explained to the general public. Now, what is unique about the Bloomington approach to the behavioral theory is that it takes the various features of biophysical and sociocultural context very, very seriously. Now, the focus on context as well as the empirical research for studying actual user behavior is unique because, in the mainstream economics and political science, you always assume what the user preferences are based on their rational, self-interested behavior. And then you expect to see those behaviors, and any deviation from behavior is supposed to be sort of, a side problem. It's not the main theoretical problem. But the main theoretical focus of the Bloomington School is to understand the actual user behavior in particular context, and the IAD framework that allows us to do that. Now, interestingly, both the mainstream neoliberal or neoclassical economics, as well as the Marxist framework, shares this same idea of a prefigured framework, which takes the user behavior for granted. Economists expect one kind of user behavior, and Marxists expect another kind of user behavior. But analytically speaking, both these approaches have a framework that sort of predetermines what the users are supposed to do under a master narrative of either a self-interested rational human behavior or the behavior of the proletariat under a particular kind of capitalist system. So Bloomington School differs from both of these frameworks in the sense that it takes the local context very seriously, and it actually models the actual user behavior as opposed to sort of going by what the theory tells us should be the user behavior.
That's interesting. I mean, if effectively what you're saying there is that, in a way, the kind of rational choice theory you have in neoclassical economics and Marxist approaches, they're both a kind of structuralism, which gives a kind of predictive to the way that people behave, that people in a certain situation, you can predict directly what their behavior will be. You can predict, for example, that they won't overcome a commons problem. Or perhaps that they will if you've got the structural parameters identified. What you're saying is that the Ostrom's depart from that view. I think it's worth exploring that in relation to, because they are often seen as rational choice theorists. And rational choice theory is associated with, what's usually described as methodological individualism. And it strikes me what you're saying would be compatible with a view which is saying that the problem with rational choice theory is it's actually not sensitive enough to the context within which rationality is formed.
Absolutely.
Both to cultural factors, but also even at a certain level, you could say it's not individualist enough because it doesn't understand necessarily what's in the heads of some of the actors that are directly in the ground facing a particular situation. Would that be fair?
Yes, and I think your framing of this, the neoclassical, neoliberal economics way of thinking about individuals as structuralists is actually very instructive and insightful. And similarly, of course, Marxists are known for structuralism. But so the Bloomington School still retains the fundamental focus on methodological individualism. Without actually sacrificing a nuanced analysis of the context within which individuals behave. So, and I think that's what makes the Bloomington School distinctively different from these two other dominant schools, so that behavioral outcomes are studied at the individual levels. Even though, as opposed to the mainstream behavioral theories of economics and political science, the Bloomington School takes both the features of socioeconomic, biophysical, and cultural context seriously, but it pays careful attention to the ways in which individuals make and enforce decisions regarding some kind of collective action, whether it is for the commons or for the provision of urban public goods and so forth. Now, this anchoring of a Lynn's work and the work of other workshoppers in a nuanced framework of methodological individualism, it lends a kind of analytical discipline that you don't see in either of those two other approaches.
Yes, I mean, the way I see what they're doing, and you give me correct me if I'm wrong, the way I see what they're doing is that they subscribe to a looser notion of rationality than you have in rational choice theory. It's more of a bounded rationality view that the actors are fallible. And because the actors are fallible, in a sense, they are more entrepreneurial agents in the sense that they use the resources that are around them in creative ways, the culture, the local norms, the social capital. They have to sort of piece these things together to try to address collective action problems. And it's that element that introduces the sort of unpredictability, the fact that the theorist abstract rational choice models may not understand the way that the actors on the ground perceive what the choice structure actually is that faces the agents.
Right, absolutely. And this is why this discussion is so fascinating, because each of these core concepts that we have talked about, rationality, methodological individualism, bounded rationality, they are, at a broader level, they underlie both the mainstream approaches to behavioral analysis as well as the Bloomington School, but they're used very differently. So even if we think about bounded rationality, right? So when mainstream economists, or even new institutional economists such as Douglas North, when they use bounded rationality, they're only focusing on the constraints to do with limits to cognition, for example, or lack of knowledge, for example, right? So, but they still maintain this notion that preferences are exogenous and they are prefigured. Now, if there's an article that Lynn wrote, I think in 2003, it's called Toward a Behavioral Theory of Collective Action. And in that article, Lynn shows how local cultural norms, as well as interactions between different users, where over time, they develop trust and relationships of belonging and trust and mutual respect. These relationships can alter preferences, right? So users that did not want to contribute to commons management in a pre-collective action situation, their preferences can be changed over time, so that now they find it in their self-interested, in their bounded self-interest. But this bound is now set up by a changed positive context, in the sense that now the community context makes the local collective action more viable, right? So their preferences have been changed to some extent. And so this is, the economist cannot model changes in preferences within such a short span of time, or within one particular situation.
Well, arguably, it's not just a change in preferences that you're talking about there. You're actually talking about changes in the nature of the actor, almost, that by participating in certain circumstances, the character of the actor actually changes. It's not just preferences, it's almost perceptions of the world and the way it functions, and of other actors within that world that may change through interaction.
Absolutely. And this is actually, so this reminds me, we are doing some new work to create bridges between the Ostrom School of Commons work and some of the critical scholarship on commons, which comes from other theoretical backgrounds. And so, for example, Neera Singh's work in India, she has shown that users sort of start off by getting into forest protection because they think of self-interest, and her work is focused mainly on women forest users. But she shows that over time, these interactions actually develop into more effective kind of relationship vis-a-vis one another between the users, but also between the forest and users. And so she has this framework of effective ecologies, which, interestingly starts off with some kind of a common situation, which is pretty much sort of rationally driven, but then it develops into a much different kind of engagement between the forest and the users. And that's so this is a beautiful example to show how, as you said, users change over time because of these interactions, but also showing how the Ostrom work can be bridged with other kinds of theoretical arguments. If we are thinking about the individual preferences and understandings and worldviews in a more nuanced way than we see in the mainstream.
Well, it's interesting that you're mentioning, really effectively the importance of communication, and the problem with, really stripped down forms of rational choice in game theory is that people are put into prisoner's dilemma games or other kind of games where they don't actually, by the very nature of the model, they're not allowed to or able to communicate with other actors. But actually, if you're in real world situations where people have got the scope to engage in communication, the very active communication can change the structure of the game. And that seems to me a fundamental point that the Ostroms are onto, but maybe perhaps they could sometimes have been more explicit in bringing that element out of what they were saying.
Absolutely. In fact, the prisoner's dilemma argument was central to the argument that Lynn made throughout her career. I mean, of course, the 1990 book has an entire chapter devoted to these kinds of dilemmas and how it kind of traps the user in an analytical prison, so as to say, right? So I think this point was communicated pretty strongly, but I think what happened was that the way in which Lynn's work was received in different communities, and this is a point that we will come back to again in some of the other discussions maybe, but they selectively took certain conclusions and implications of the work without always taking seriously the sort of foundations of the work, right? And that's been my argument, that I think that has not been talked about enough. And then the other thing is that the focus on communications can sometimes ignore the fact that these relationships are built within a particular social world, right? So there's a sociological and cultural dimension to the user interactions within the context of local commons, right? So it's not just like out and out communication as in you, right? But it's a richer engagement with the life worlds of these users in these particular local settings.
So one of the things you'd have to look at in those situations are relationships of power between different actors at the local level to understand, what the incentives are, the sort of cultural framings that are happening in different places and how that might vary from place to place.
Right. So, I think the question of power has been an extremely important question in the context of the commons, which I and some other workshoppers have been arguing that we need to pay more attention to. But that work is relatively recent. It's come up within last 5 to 8 years, in some cases 10 years or so. But by and large, before this recent round of work about which we can talk at more length, I've argued that the Bloomington School of Institutional Analysis and the Commons work has paid inadequate attention to the question of power, especially social and political power.
Well, I'm going to come back to that in some of the other questions I'd like to ask you, because I think it is a very important area of inquiry that, as you say, it's starting to be developed. But at the moment it's perhaps underdeveloped. But before we do that, I wonder if you could just carry on along the line of thinking about Lynn Ostrom's work on the commons and on those kind of problems. So you made reference quite effectively, I felt, in your presentation to the fact that although she's often associated with this idea of extending the realm of bottom-up community governance solutions to some of these issues, she was also very clear to say that people should avoid what she called the panacea trap.
Right.
So in the same way that private property isn't always the answer, or state property isn't always the answer, she was also saying that community governance isn't always the answer. And the IAD framework and the various design principles that she speaks about are an attempt to set out, at least as I understand it, some kind of principle framework for trying to determine when these different solutions may or may not be appropriate, and how that varies according to the character of the resource, the character of the population, the kind of relationships between formal and informal rules that there are in particular situations. Is that right?
That's correct. So one of the most frequent references in Lynn's talks and conversations around the round table at the workshop was her warning against falling into panacea trap, right? And if you've been in a Lynn Ostrom seminar, you can sort of visualize her sort of literally jumping up up and down as she would say some of these things, and it's funny how sometimes if someone said the state by mistake, she'll like jump 3 feet and say the state, the community, right? So she was, I mean, this is not just like one particular argument, but there was an entire set of discursive tools that she had to sort of, argue against any kind of vocabulary of creating a monolithic understanding of anything, right? And so so she gave these warnings very frequently. For example, I mean, if you think about Garrett Hardin's rather poorly conceptualized arguments, they led him to advocate privatization or nationalization as the only means through which one could avoid the tragedy of the commons. And again, that Lynn would argue that that was kind of a panacea thinking. So it's important to underline here that Hardin's argument itself was a sort of panacea framework, because he said these are the only things that can solve the so-called tragedy of the commons. But as we talked about earlier, many users of the design principle, they ended up, whether they wanted it or not, or whether it was intentional or unintentional, the design principle of the commons ended up being cited as sort of silver bullet instruments that, if a community, it looks like a community meets the criteria outlined in design principles, this was sort of taken as a guarantee that they would manage their commons effectively. And of course, as we have talked about previously, even some of the most fundamental and narrowly defined concepts, such as bounded rationality and methodological individualism, they were deployed in a very nuanced way, right? So workshop was about crafting everything, right? So you would craft everything. And so compared to these finely and narrowly defined concepts, design principles are actually quite blunt, right? So they are these kinds of indicator instruments that you use as a means of sort of starting off your investigation into the management of commons. But because of the popular narrative around the design principles became as if, this is sort of a formula to, put some numbers into and churn out. And there've been, of course, statistical analyses of these kinds, where you use design principle as a sort of variable generating, sort of mechanism. Because of that, there's been an impression that, community-based solutions are sort of a panacea, right? And again, towards the end of Lynn's work, her life, very well-lived life, she was actually focusing quite significantly on repeating again and again that community-based solutions are not a panacea, because she started realizing that this was being portrayed as a panacea. And so these kinds of the uses of the design principles or the commons work in general, they tend to neglect or mention only in passing some features of political context, or sometimes they entirely sort of neglect these features. For example, if you think about government agencies throughout the global south, they have enormous power. They virtually own land. And for example, in India, 22.5% of the land is quote unquote owned by forestry agencies, because they are the legal owners of the land, not just the regulating agency. And so how would a local community mobilization and collective action differ in context where these government agencies at the local level, right? Not the Uncle Sam sitting in Delhi or London, but local government agencies and local forest officials, what kind of power they wield in the local resource management settings. Once we account for that, our analysis of community-based collective action changes very dramatically. Because then, the context that we talked about, that context is now fundamentally different from what you generally think of as the local natural resource management context.
Well, just reacting to what you were saying there, thinking about it, there's quite a important methodological point there as well, isn't there? That what you're saying is that the design principles or the IAD framework shouldn't be seen as a kind of overly predictive framework, that if you've got these factors in place, then a certain result will follow. That will be falling into a sort of, although I think there are sort of positivist elements to a lot of the Ostrom's work, it will be falling into that kind of predictive, scientistic almost form of positivism, where if you have these variables in place, these institutional variables, you will get X outcome. And what you're saying is that it's actually much more complex than that, even that seems to me you're almost saying that the predictive element has to be questioned. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. I think, and then again, Mark, this is a wonderfully instructive way of framing this, that, instead of using design principles as a predictive tool, they were meant, it's actually written in the preface and the first chapter of Governing the Commons, that they were meant as diagnostic tools. Now, there's a difference between, right, using something as a diagnostic tool, and if you look at the latter work of Lynn, the socio-ecological framework, the word diagnostic is in the titles of some of those important articles that Lynn authored or co-authored. And so I think if we use the design principles as diagnostic tools, but then also remember that the way in which any of these design principles work in particular context will again have to be subjected to the context sensitivity that the IAD framework asks us to do, right? So you have to put each of these design principles within that particular context and then see how it works.
So that sounds very similar to me to, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the sort of analytic narrative method, that instead of sort of looking at variables from the outside and predicting, you actually go on into particular cases, trying to understand on the ground what the institutional details are, what the cultural factors are, and then you only try to predict from within the case what you think the structure of the game, the kind of outcomes it will lead to. So it's an argument for a kind of deep level sort of ethnography almost in trying to understand the way these kind of game structures play out.
Right. So there is quite a bit of commonality and intersection between the method of analytical narratives and the way in which Bloomington School of Commons research is supposed to work. But there's also fundamental differences. And the way, so if you think about it, deductive, a research that is driven by an a priori theoretical framework versus inductive, which is driven entirely by what you actually see in your field research. There's also a third option, which is of abductive research. And I would put the workshop research in that frame of abductive research, so that it actually lends itself to sort of being used in both deductive or predominantly deductive ways or predominantly inductive ways. But it actually acts as that abductive bridge between the two. And I would argue that we need to do more methodological work to sort of, hone those tools of abductive research in the commons. Because I think it is extremely important to consider that there are these big ticket questions that everybody should think about, right? So you can't just go in the field and start sort of, looking at all kinds of things. Of course, that will produce certain kinds of outcomes that may be of interest to many of us. But the process of accumulation of knowledge works best when we build on pre-existing theories and sort of, pinch and, kind of work, craft these theories at the margins. So try and refine the theories in ways that also contribute to the accumulated stock of knowledge and science, in a sense.
Okay, that's great. Okay, well let's move on maybe to talk a little bit more about the issue of power in the Ostrom's framework and what what role it does play and what role it doesn't play, and when, you know, whether they have their understanding of power correct. So in your more critical remarks, you made the case that, you know, the Ostroms arguably don't pay enough attention to power relations at multiple sort of levels, that you think this is an underdeveloped aspect of the Bloomington School's work. Now, some people would find that quite surprising, in the sense that they might argue that power, if we understand that to be the incentive structures that are created for agents within interacting sets of rules at different sorts of levels, are fundamental to the Ostrom's approach. So if you take some of the examples that Lynn Ostrom talks about, where centralized imposition of state property or private property has had negative consequences, it seems that those consequences wouldn't have arisen if it hadn't been for the fact that the higher level actors had the power to impose particular types of solutions on lower level actors. So an example like that would seem to suggest that power is at the heart of the Ostrom's approach. So would you agree with that, or do you think it's just that it's more complicated than that?
This is a fantastic question. And again, your framing sort of implies in very instructive ways two different aspects of power in institutional analysis that are worth unpacking a little. First, let's take this concept of power understood as the incentive structure created by interacting sets of rules and relationships, as you put it. Analytically speaking, incentive structures are meant to steer individual human behavior, right? I mean, that this is from within the core tenets of institutional economics, so as to say. However, if you know, the expectations that incentive structures steer human behavior is based on certain assumptions about autonomous individual behavior. And these assumptions ignore how inequalities of race, caste, class, gender, and other types of social cultural inequalities inhibit the exercise of autonomous decision-making on the part of some of the individuals or groups of individuals. So studying the incentive structures focused specifically on commons governance tells us little about how these other extraneous or external factors, such as, you know, race, caste, class, gender, and the imperatives that are linked to these identities or these structures shape individual behaviors in all kinds of settings, including in commons, right? So power relations are, of course, embedded within incentive structures, but you cannot take it for granted that because we study incentive structures, we will study these other factors. And as you can imagine, there are many, in fact, most of the common studies. So the editors of the International Journal of the Commons, they did a extensive bibliographic analysis of all of the commons research that has been published over the years in that journal. And they found that only in few cases, things such as inequality, race, power were actually mentioned in the commons scholarship, right? So it's when you, if we think about the sort of, you know, empirical statistical methods, if you don't include a variable in your analysis, that's an omitted variable bias, right? Which means that you can't tell how that variable influenced the outcome that you're looking at. And so this work that I did on sort of, you know, trying to understand how these factors of race, caste, race, class, gender, and other types of social inequalities influence individual behavior. This is at the micro level, right? So I've developed this micro argument in an article that I published in 2016 in the Journal of Theoretical Politics. In Ostrom speak, I argue in that article that individual behavior should be studied within the context of interlinked action arenas. So you can, in most common parlance of the workshop scholarship, you think of, common pool resource management or commons governance as being shaped by an action arena where you have individuals, you have the resource, and you have the various kinds of interactions between different individuals and actors vis-a-vis the resource, right? So that's sort of one action arena, the arena within which action takes place vis-a-vis the particular set of common resources. Now, I've argued that how these individuals behave in that commons action arena will also be shaped by the other kinds of social and cultural relations that individuals have in other action arenas, such as social, even if you think about family, in cultures where wife is always supposed to defer to the husband on anything and everything, if both wife and husband are also part of the commons action arena, that behavior in those common settings cannot be understood from an autonomous decision-making framework, because the wife's behavior will be based on how she's supposed to behave in a social setting where her husband is also present, right? Or if you have caste relations, for example, you would behave vis-a-vis the so-called upper caste people in a certain way, which you wouldn't be able to predict or study if you were using the sort of the incentive structure frame of analysis and reference.
Can I just push you on this a little bit, because this is a really interesting point. So I can imagine someone reacting to what you're saying who is a kind of new institutionalist, and they would probably say, well, we would consider something like caste in our analysis in the sense of it's a sort of cultural variable which would feed into the kind of incentive structure that people face, or relationships within a household between men and women, that they would understand that to be one of the factors that shape the incentive structure. So it seems to me you're saying something beyond that.
Yes.
I wonder if you could explain how you would respond to that kind of argument.
That's great. And in fact, this is really the fundamental difference in how behavioralism is understood in mainstream political science versus how the Ostrom and workshoppers practice their behavioralism. So their argument would be to restate what you said, and I think because this is so important, and sometimes those who are not familiar with these debates may not have fully understood what you said. So the behavioralists in mainstream economics and political science would say that the way an individual behaves already factors in all of those extraneous considerations, right? So it doesn't matter if you study those 10 or different 15 factors or not, as long as you're correctly capturing the behavior, those factors are already accounted for. So you don't need to study them separately, right? So this goes along with your earlier argument that some workshoppers have argued that power is already inherent in how the rules are framed and practiced. But the problem is, and in fact, this actually also speaks to a broader debate in political economy more broadly, going beyond the debates of commons and so forth, where the political economists who have acknowledged the importance of these factors, and they have sort of variabilized these different things, caste, gender, right? They have still not been able to grapple with how these things function in practice, in part because this is not a situation where 1 + 1 becomes 2, right? So there's an idea that if we want to understand the political economy of any kind, including the political economy of commons, we need to adopt a configurational approach to these things, right? So and I think the scholars who have made arguments about intersectionality, right? They have actually shown how intersectionality is different, for example, from simply putting in two variables and then using an interaction term in the statistical analysis, right? Because they argue that what is at stake in intersectionality is not just the presence of two different factors, but how the interactions of two factors such as race and gender produce patterns of privileges and disadvantages in the same setting, right? So interaction of gender and race provide certain privileges to certain individuals, including white women, for example. And that incentive structure and the way in which they are able to exercise autonomous decision-making and behavior is fundamentally different from intersectionality at the lower end of marginalization, where intersectionality acts to prevent autonomous behavior and autonomous decision-making, right? And so, the same interaction of two factors has remarkably different effects for different groups within the same group. And this is methodologically, you cannot account for this by sort of, accounting for the interaction terms, partly because, there are other factors that come into play. And so this becomes like an indefinite fight to sort of include triple interaction and so forth. The last point I will make on this is that, and this is actually the core argument of the Journal of Theoretical Politics article that I cited earlier, which is that when you don't account for these power relations, the weaker, powerless individuals within a community, they agree to contribute to collective action because they fear the wrath of the powerful village leaders, right? So they are doing something out of implied coercion in a situation, but we are studying their behavior as a positive contribution to collective
As if it's a bottom-up formation.
Yeah. Right? This is a bottom-up formation, and it has, you have to get into what drives behavior. The same behavior can have different drivers, and this is something that has been acknowledged by the phrase equifinality, so that you can have remarkably different drivers of the same outcomes.
Yeah. So does this require, though, a different type of methodological approach? So if you're going to understand how the kind of power relations you're referring to affect outcomes, and also perhaps also the way that we evaluate them, you need to adopt what sounds to me much more like, I guess I would call it a hermeneutic kind of an approach, where you're actually trying to understand the deep meanings that are attributed to certain performances or the nature of institutions in particular communities. So you're going to try to understand, what does caste mean in a particular situation to particular sorts of actors, rather than having the sort of theorists from outside imposing their categories on these sets of actors.
I guess so, but one fundamental difference here is that, the interpretivist method and the hermeneutics, it's sort of a, a free for all kind of approach, where you can't claim authenticity for any one particular kind of interpretation. Your interpretation is always considered to be subjective, and this kind, one type of interpretation is equally valid as opposed to another kind of interpretation of the same situation, which may even be contradicted, right? So taking the same example, a hermeneutics framework would say that my argument that collective action in that particular setting is driven by coercive relationships is equally valid compared to another argument where somebody is claiming that, we ought to recognize the agency of the person, and this is an autonomous decision making. Where I would differ from that approach is to argue that no, social and political context have very particular meanings. In those situations, these two arguments are not equally valid. If you take a historically grounded and locally informed understanding of how these factors of caste, class, race, and gender operate, there's one particular right interpretation of those interactions, rather than, right? So that's the difference.
Yeah,
Right.
I actually think, I mean, I don't know whether you've seen it. There's an interesting book by Mark Bevere. He has a book out on with Jason Blakely. It's called Interpretive Social Science. And he puts a different view forward. He would say that interpretivism is compatible with the idea of some element of objective truth, in the sense that it's all about telling stories. But some stories are more convincing than others. There are certain stories that are more plausible, that the concepts they use don't face as many anomalies, for example, as other types of stories, and that you arrive at a kind of, I guess really the term to use would be an intersubjective judgment of which stories are more convincing. So interpretivism doesn't have to mean a sort of free-for-all that, you know, any one meaning is as good as any other.
Sure, and I think that's a very important argument. With the two sort of caveats. One, I would actually use some sort of a truth claim frame as opposed to the convincing frame, right? And this is, I think, now we are going way beyond the comments, but I think these are all important discussions. This is where the ways in which a scholar's standing as a citizen, somebody who's deeply familiar with a particular setting and is politically engaged in certain ways, comes into play, right? So you could be an outsider who has done 10 years of field research in one particular site. Then I would take your interpretation as more closer to truth claims compared to another scholar who came yesterday and who's trying to make a similar kind of, or a different kind of truth claim, right? So that's one part. Second is that, even between people who have had long-term engagements with the same sites, if somebody is engaged with a particular site and a particular research process as a citizen who has a political stake in that particular context, that interpretation needs to be understood differently, not necessarily biased, right? Because every research conclusion has certain kinds of implications, normative undertones and normative implications, right? And so which of those normative undertones and which of those normative implications you pick or you leave out basically depends on the kind of stakes that you have, right? So I would argue that I think that's, and I look forward to actually reading the book by Mark Baver. And I think that's a valid way of thinking about it. And I think it's methodologically very rich approach to thinking about and sort of engaging with this notion of public facing scholarship, right? Publicly engaged scholarship. And with the global, with the idea of global sort of citizenship, we have, I think this is a very productive avenue for further research.
Great. So let's actually moving on a similar sort of theme, talking about maybe carrying on with this discussion about thinking about power in different ways. So one of the things I took from your presentation was that when we're looking at some of these sort of higher level contextual factors that affect the nature of some of the commons problems, you spoke about the importance of discourse as part of the sort of set of power relations that we need to be trying to understand. And I wonder if you could say what you understand by the term discourse in an institutional analysis. So how does it differ from, Douglas North has this idea of shared mental models, of there being sort of shared cognitive frames between actors that then can condition the sort of incentive structures that people perceive. Are you using discourse in that sort of way, or are you using more in a way that somebody like Foucault would have spoken of it, perhaps, where certain kinds of discursive frames or formations actually affect the positionality of actors? So they say something about who is speaking or the authority of different sorts of agents in particular sorts of settings. I wonder if you could say something about what your understanding of discourse is.
Sure. So as I see it, these concepts differ in some fundamental ways. Although I can clearly see how, in many settings, the two can sort of converge. at least in terms of how they relate to one another. Now, mental models are the ways of thinking that individuals use to inform their own decision making or behavior. Or mental models is something that individuals use to understand other people's thinking and behavior on certain things, right? And so if we think about how mental models shape what individuals say, mental models do shape the kind of discourses that different individuals make or believe in and so forth. But the notion of discourses is sort of, that the other side of this story, which is that discourses are a set of interrelated arguments that are meant to be, they have a public purpose in a sense, right? They are meant to be communicated or articulated publicly, often with the goal of actually shaping public thinking or behavior in certain ways. So for example, in the current context, there's an entire discourse around so-called nature-based solutions. So this I would call as a discourse, which has often been tied to community-based natural resource management and to the advocacy of indigenous rights and so forth. However, a deeper scrutiny would reveal that the popularity of nature-based solutions is actually a manifestation of the kind of power that global elite wield in shaping public understanding of a particular topic. So I would argue that nature-based solutions emerges out of a certain kind of mental model or set of mental models, but it's in its public existence, it has become a sort of discourse or a narrative. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds quite similar, actually, the way you describe that there. It sounds a bit more like Foucault's ideas about power knowledge, that you actually have agents who have a set of mental models, but they also use their political power to, in effect, impose certain interpretations in certain situations.
Absolutely.
That kind of idea.
Yes, so it's closer to the Foucauldian sense of discourse, but it does take seriously, I mean, the way in which we study it, it does account for those different types of mental models.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. So if we move on a little bit now towards the end of your presentation, you spoke really quite passionately, I think, about why you think that when it comes to thinking about climate change, there are profound limitations to the Ostrom's approach, and partly that was following, I think, from some of the things you were saying about power at the global level. And you also seem to be implying that this is a case where you can't leave this to sort of some form of polycentric set of arrangements to emerge from the ground up, that you do need to have quite a lot of top-down control.
Right.
And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to, I was thinking when you gave that presentation of you debating Eleanor Ostrom, because, you know, she wrote a paper for the World Bank, I think it was in about 2009, which was really arguing that, okay, maybe there's some necessity to have a global level approach to climate change, but she, on the one hand, seemed deeply skeptical about whether you would actually get such a global response, given the nature of the collective action problems involved. And B, she also seemed very skeptical about whether it would be effective for some of the same reasons that she was critical of centralizing schemes in other cases. So I wonder if we can think of carrying on your argument with Eleanor Ostrom there about why it is that you do think, you know, why do you argue against her in effect in this case?
So I'll come back to this, whether this is against or not. It'll sort of depend on how we negotiate this discussion.
Yeah.
But I think it relates to is the second part of your earlier question on power that I failed to sort of address. So I think it's a good sort of moment to bring that in. And there you said that the diagnosis of the failure of centralized solutions to commons dilemmas lie in the capacity of higher level actors to impose solutions on lower level actors, right? Now, climate change and climate crisis, as we now use the more accurate vocabulary, is actually a result of the ability of the powerful political and economic elites to impose certain kinds of externalities on the rest of humanity, right, on the majority populations. So in that sense, I think it's obviously a reflection of power that central actors have, the powerful global actors have imposed a climate crisis on the rest of the humanity. Now, the commons community has conventionally argued that when you have these centralized actors wanting to impose their control on the commons, the solution is to actually sort of do decentralized, right? Decentralized decision-making power and authority to local users. So, that cuts in so many different ways. One, of course, if we only think about the top down and bottom up in terms of negative power on the top down side and positive power on the bottom up side, I think we miss the argument about democracy, right? We miss the fact that there are certain kinds of societal level failures and the need to provide societal level public goods that can only be accomplished by higher level state action, if you will. Right? So there's a fundamental theoretical argument that comes from within institutional economics that requires higher level political action for the provision of public goods that markets cannot provide. And that, because local actors are they don't have jurisdiction over higher scale landscapes and geographies where these outcomes unfold. Local community cannot impose taxes on a fossil fuel corporation, which is polluting their local commons, right? So that's one part of it that I think this has been the mistake. And this is, again, what we refer to as analytical slippage between the critique of the centralized imposition and the advocacy of local governance. Both of them were valid, but they intersect in all sorts of ways. So in the 2010 paper that Lynn wrote for Global Environmental Change, I think, Lynn recognized and used the phrase local tyrannies, right? And she said, if we leave everything to the locals, it will lead to local tyrannies. The other side of that argument is that climate change is actually, in a way, it's also a product of those kinds of local freedoms. Everybody was free to pollute as much as they could, right? Now, the problem is that that process unfolds both at the individual level, but also at the global level. So you have 9 or 10 corporations. The research that climate accountability scorecard that the Union for Concerned Scientists have come up with, they show that a good chunk of the historically accumulated stock of greenhouse gases responsible for climate crisis has come from a handful of corporations, fossil fuel corporations, who have benefited from that business. Besides, they have actually orchestrated a long-running multi-decadal process of climate denialism. They were able to recruit quote-unquote scientists to sing their song of climate denialism, right? So all of these examples tell us that there's a fundamental structural problem that emerged from the imbalances of power and concentration of power in the hands of powerful global political and economic elites, powerful national political and economic elites, right? So it's important to fix their behavior to address the ongoing climate crisis, right? And that fixing their behavior will not happen through community-based approaches or local-based approaches, right? So that was the argument I was trying to make. I wasn't arguing a black and white sort of my argument about the need for these specific structural reforms did not mean that we don't need long-term polycentric governance that will steer our collective behaviors on, food consumption, flying around the world, or any of the energy intensive lifestyles. We have to have a transnational mass movement that can only be triggered through sort of a polycentric social cultural campaign, so as to say, right? So we need
No, I mean,
both.
I think that's a very interesting formulation, and I think it's a very persuasive point to say one way of looking at climate change is if at the global level there's a kind of vacuum where nobody is doing anything, and that's the view of it as a collective action problem in a sense. What you're saying is there already are actually power structures there that are affecting people. And that's where the focus of attention, at least in part, should be. I think, we got into a little bit of this in the discussion following your talk. I think the issue is, if part of your argument is that those powerful actors are in place, what is to stop effectively a version of a sort of regulated capture arising if you try to create structures at the global level to address the problem? So why wouldn't those agents who are in power on your account usurp or get round or seek to control the very kind of reform process that you're referring to? So obviously there's an argument that, well, you need a functioning democracy to stop that from happening. But the issue is precisely that at the global level, there isn't such a structure. And we don't necessarily know what mechanisms or what processes will be required to arrive at one. So that was where I felt the tension was, where you got some of the pushback against your argument.
Right. So the good thing is that we actually have, by now, we have empirical evidence about these competing arguments and what effects they have on climate change per se, for example. So let me sort of, let us go back to the history of the evolution of the global climate mitigation, global climate governance systems under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Before or around the time when Kyoto Protocol was being debated, Brazil had a proposal. They brought in a proposal to sort of argue for establishing a global fund that will be populated by the penalties that emitters would pay into this global fund. Mm-hmm. And this was exactly the argument that was used by the US delegation and even many scholars, that, such a, and this was like, mid 90s, right? 1995 or something like that. And so what we did, we actually rejected that centralized solution, right? And we went along with the so-called polycentric approaches where, there was like, okay, let's do offsets. Every state, every city will do their own offsets. We will retrofit the buildings. So urban governance, municipal bodies will do certain things. Industries will do their own thing. Then there's cities for 40 network, and they will motivate the cities to act and all of that. And I think, if needed, we can actually pull together the empirical evidence about the complete inefficacy of any of these so-called, and I need to actually come back to this notion of polycentric, because I think it's been used again, in a sort of glib ways that do not do justice to the way it was actually intended to be used. Yeah. But the evidence that we have on the extremely limited success of these polycentric approaches that we adopted, at least since the 2007 Bali conference. Bali conference was the setting where the dominance of market-based solutions to climate crisis was accepted, and it was institutionalized in the form of acceptance of the offsets. There was going to be a climate, the stock market of climate emissions, right? There's a kind of, all kinds of institutional arrangements, the forest-based carbon sequestration programs and the REDD+ program. So all of that was initiated and institutionalized in 2007. The evidence that we have on all of those kinds of market-based climate solutions is that They produced fictitious or spurious kind of emission records and certifications. They created dispossessions, these so-called green grabs, or grabbed commons situation, where commons were grabbed in the name of doing carbon sequestration. And the funny thing is, and I think this is where we really see how the structuralist and the bottom-up approaches come together, is that in many cases, programs such as Red Plus were justified and in many ways were sort of tied to community-based management. So you said, right? The argument was that we will bring in these user groups and they will then be able to benefit from Red Plus and so forth. And the tragedy is that the critique of Red Plus have mostly been from the radical left and the critical social science, who made this about a critique of the markets. Now, obviously, markets fail here because they were expected to fail if you go by the theory of how markets work, right? Because this is not a setting where you would expect free markets to operate. But the more fundamental problem was a political problem, that governments who got these monies from World Bank and UN Environmental Program and other kinds of global environmental facility, they captured these resources. So this structural top-down capture happened precisely in these so-called bottom-up polycentric arrangements, right? And I would argue that this happened because they were not truly polycentric, right? They were polycentric in their narratives, in their discourses, but they were very top-down in the way in which they were designed and enforced. You have an entire industry of consultants and experts who consume enormous amount of this kind of offset money that should have been going to these community-based groups, right? So I would argue personally, I would never oppose these kinds of market-based arrangements if you actually ensure that the resources actually, percolated down to these community-based groups. So I think there is a very strong argument now, both based on the empirical evidence that we have for past 20 years of failed climate action and climate governance, but as well as on the new theoretical developments that have happened since 2010, to argue that we need to understand climate crisis and many of these kinds of wicked problems in global environment and development fields as multi-scale complex problems that are shaped in very fundamental ways by these differences of power and factors of inequality. So, to tie it back to the development of the work that has taken power and inequality seriously and has sought to bring those factors explicitly into institutional analysis and an analysis of the commons governance. In 2019, in collaboration with Lauren McLean and Gustavo Garcia Lopez, we published a special issue of World Development by the title of Rethinking Institutions and Power in the Shadows of Neoliberal World, on Shadows of Neoliberalism. In that special issue and the introductory article to that special issue, we propose a power in institutions matrix. So what we do in the matrix is that we take different forms of power, as argued by political scientists and other theorists of power. So, you have things such as agenda power, right? Who decides what kind of questions are taken up in the public sphere? Yeah. Then you have the discursive or narrative power, right? So who is defining what is meant by nature-based solutions? But then you also have the material power, which shapes how these narratives are actually translated into practical operational guidelines and practical programs. So those are the different forms of power. And then on the y-axis, we took the power over, which is the sense of coercive use of power, and power to, which is the sense that there's a bottom-up process of creating power. And so in this power matrix, we bring together different forms of power and different scales of institutional design and functioning to argue that scholars of institutional analysis and scholars of commons can actually account for power in a way that goes along very well with the IAD framework or the commons design principle. And we can retain, and this is the last point I'll make on this, which is that, for example, we explained the concept of co-option, right? Co-option is often thought of as a negative thing, right? So powerful actors co-opt powerless actors, but we put co-option right at the intersection of power over and power to, and we actually include it in power to, because only by creating incentives for powerless people, powerful actors get things done, right? So if you have situations of gross inequality and poverty at local level, you can always pay off some things or a little bit to make poor people behave in certain ways. But that's not necessarily bottom up, right? But in a way that is bottom up. And I think that's where the dilemma of the the relationship between structure and agency need to be taken seriously from both ends without excluding one or the other. And so that was my whole argument about how we need to think about the governance of climate crisis.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, please do, if you could please send me the link to that paper, the World Development Issue, and I'd love to publicize that on our website, actually, because I think that sounds like a fascinating example, actually, of bringing together all of the themes that we've been talking about in this discussion between the two of us today. And we've got the G7 meeting going on in the UK, actually, this weekend that we're recording. So obviously, a lot of the issues that you're talking about are relevant to some of the things that they're discussing there. So really all I want to say, Prakash, is thank you very much for such a fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you have, and I hope we can have you back again at some point in the not too distant future to carry on the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. This was such a privilege and such a wonderful conversation. As I mentioned, and I think I want to sort of highlight again how the way you framed some of these questions was so productive, and we were able to get into these conversations. So yeah, thanks for having me, and yeah, look forward to our future conversations as well.
Thank you very much.